10:17 a.m. Persian Gulf, 44 nautical miles northwest of Qatar. 8 Iranian IRGCN fast attack boats just opened fire simultaneously. 4 rounds of warning shots across the bow of USS McFaul, 2 rounds from vessels behind the ship's stern, and 1 burst from a boat that had positioned itself dead on the port beam at 220 meters. 220 meters. At that range, if the next burst was not a warning, there was no time to respond. USS McFaul was surrounded. What happened in the next 23 minutes was the most dangerous close-quarters confrontation between the U.S. Navy and the IRGCN in the Persian Gulf since the 1980s. And the way it ended changed what both sides understood about where the line actually was. Welcome to Navy Poverline, where we break down the engagements that define the real rules of the Gulf. To understand the full weight of what was happening to USS McFaul at 10:17 that morning, you need to understand the geometry of what the IRGCN had constructed around her. 8 fast attack boats do not accidentally end up in a coordinated encirclement of a U.S. Navy guided missile destroyer. 8 boats in that configuration, spread across all 4 bearings, bow and stern covered, both beams occupied at close range, firing simultaneously on signal, represent hours of planning, rehearsed maneuver doctrine, and a command decision made at a level well above a field officer. Someone with authority in the IRGCN chain of command had ordered this. Someone had decided that on this morning, the standard harassment doctrine of bow crossing and radio silence was insufficient. Someone wanted an American destroyer surrounded and firing warning shots in all directions at the same time. The question of why, what strategic objective was served by this specific action on this specific morning, is the question that the intelligence community spent 6 weeks trying to answer after the incident. The working assessment that emerged was tied to a specific geopolitical event. The United States had, 3 days prior, announced the sale of a new Patriot missile battery package to Saudi Arabia, including munitions and an extended maintenance contract. Iranian state media had described the sale as a direct military threat. The IRGCN encirclement of McFaul appears, based on the timing and the scale of the operation, to have been the authorized military response to that announcement. A demonstration, a signal. You arm our enemies, we put your ships in a box. The signal was sent at close range and with guns. USS McFaul is an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer. It displaces 9,200 tons, carries 280 sailors, and is armed with an array of weapons that would annihilate 8 IRGCN fast attack boats in under 4 minutes if the rules of engagement authorized lethal fire. The 8 boats surrounding it collectively displace approximately 1,600 tons, carry crews of between 6 and 12 personnel each, and are armed with machine guns, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, and in several cases, radar-guided anti-ship missiles. The IRGCN commanders were not planning to die that morning. Their calculation was identical to the helicopter incident, identical to the straight blocking operation, identical to every previous Iranian provocation in the Gulf that had not triggered an immediate lethal U.S. response. The Americans will not shoot first in a situation that requires them to explain it afterward. That calculation had been tested repeatedly over 2 decades. It had held every time. McFaul's commanding officer had 280 crew members aboard. A ship surrounded at ranges between 200 and 800 meters by armed hostile vessels that had already fired, and a rules of engagement framework that authorized lethal defensive fire, while simultaneously placing the enormous political weight of killing dozens of Iranian sailors in international waters into the decision calculus. The approach of the 8 boats had not been sudden. It had been deliberate and calculated, structured to maximize the psychological and tactical pressure while minimizing the window in which McFaul could maneuver clear before the encirclement was complete. The boats had been tracked since 0841. They departed from 2 separate coastal positions and converged on a rendezvous point 22 nautical miles northeast of McFaul's position. The P-8 Poseidon on station overhead had reported the gathering of 8 contacts at 0904 and assessed them as a possible harassment formation. The threat level had been elevated to elevated, not imminent. By 0940, the 8 boats were moving toward McFaul in 2 groups of 4, approaching from the northeast and northwest simultaneously. Their speed was 28 knots. Their courses were converging. McFaul's CIC watch officer recognized the encirclement geometry at 0952 and immediately alerted the CO. Standard challenge protocol was initiated on channel 16 in both languages. 4 challenges were broadcast over the next 14 minutes. Not one was answered. At 10:04, the 8 boats had split into their final configuration: 2 forward, 2 aft, 2 starboard, 2 port, and were closing to their designated positions. The CO ordered a course change at 10:06, attempting to break through the northeastern gap before it closed. The 2 northeastern boats accelerated to 44 knots and cut off the gap. At 10:09, McFaul was encircled. The boats held their positions in a rough octagon between 180 and 850 meters from the hull. All 8 were visible from the bridge simultaneously. 8 minutes later, at 10:17, they fired. The simultaneous warning shots were coordinated by radio. The P-8 overhead recorded the burst of IRGCN communications immediately preceding the firing. It was a signal, a command. All 8 boats fired on the command of a single controller. The burst from the boat at 220 meters on the port beam, a single 3-second burst of 12.7 millimeter DSHK fire, passed 60 meters ahead of the ship's bridge. At 220 meters, that round was audible on the bridge. The crew on the port bridge wing felt the air displacement. The CO did not flinch. She was documented in the post-incident review as having given her response in a calm command voice without raising it. Her response was not to the Iranian boats. Her response was to her crew. She ordered general quarters. She ordered the Mark 38 mounts to training positions on all 4 bearing sectors, not firing, but aimed. She ordered the phalanx systems to standby engagement mode. She ordered the RHIB crews to their boats, ready to deploy. She ordered the ship's 5-inch gun to manual surface tracking mode. She did not fire. And then she got on the radio. What the CO of USS McFaul said on Channel 16 at 10:19 a.m., 2 minutes after 8 boats had fired warning shots in all directions around her ship, was documented in full in the 5th Fleet Incident Report and has not been released publicly. What is known from the review is that her transmission was in English and Farsi, that it was 47 seconds long, that it identified every visible Iranian vessel by bearing and approximate range, and that it described specifically and precisely what the United States Navy's response would be if any Iranian vessel fired again. The transmission was professional. It was not a bluff. The IRGCN controller's response came 31 seconds after her transmission ended. A single word in Farsi, broadcast on the same channel. The word translates as hold. The 8 boats held their positions. No additional shots were fired. What followed was the most tense and precisely managed naval standoff in the Gulf in a generation. At 1024, McFaul attempted again to maneuver, a slow turn to port designed to open an exit lane through the southwestern gap between 2 of the encircling boats. The 2 southwestern boats accelerated and closed the gap. McFaul reversed course. At 10:31, USS Roosevelt, an Arleigh Burke operating 47 nautical miles to the southeast, was ordered to proceed to McFaul's position at maximum speed. Roosevelt's transit time at 30 knots, approximately 94 minutes. The encirclement had been in place for 14 minutes. It was going to be in place for considerably longer. At 10:34, 2 FA-18E Super Hornets from a carrier air wing 160 nautical miles to the south were diverted to the area. Flight time, approximately 19 minutes. They arrived overhead at 10:53 and descended to 800 feet over the encirclement, low enough to be unmistakably visible and audible to every vessel below. The boats did not move. At 10:41, the IRGCN controller broadcast a statement on Channel 16. The statement described the McFaul as having violated Iranian maritime security protocols and demanded that the ship halt and submit to an inspection. The demand had no legal basis under international law. McFaul was in international waters, 44 nautical miles from the nearest Iranian territorial water baseline. No treaty, no convention, no maritime law framework recognized an Iranian right to halt and inspect a U.S. warship in international waters. The CO transmitted a single response. McFaul was operating lawfully in international waters and would not submit to any inspection. The transmission was logged and transmitted simultaneously to 5th Fleet. At 10:44, the boat on McFaul's port quarter, one of the stern pair, fired a second warning burst. Not across the bow this time, across the stern. The rounds impacted the water 40 meters behind the ship. This was a different signal from the first warning shots. The first shots were the encirclement announcement. This shot was a pressure escalation. Someone had decided that the ship's refusal to comply needed a kinetic response to see if it changed the calculation. The CO's response was immediate and precisely calibrated. She authorized the Mark 38 mount on the stern to fire a single warning burst into the water, 50 meters aft of the boat that had just fired. Returning fire in kind, at the same geometry, with the same implicit message. The 25mm burst hit the water 50 meters from the Iranian boat's stern. Silence on the radio for 14 seconds. Then, the IRGCN controller spoke again. The transmission was brief. Post-incident linguistic analysis assessed the tone as surprised. Not the word, but the vocal pattern suggested an unplanned response to an outcome that had not been fully anticipated. The boat that had fired across the stern pulled back to 400 meters. It was the first time any of the 8 boats had changed position in 27 minutes. At 1059, the two FA-18S conducted a low-altitude pass across the formation from northwest to southeast at 500 feet and approximately 400 knots. The sonic signature of 2 fully loaded Super Hornets at 500 feet and 400 knots is not subtle. The physical effect on the water surface, the pressure wave and wake turbulence, is visible. Every Iranian crew member on every boat could feel it. 2 boats on the starboard side pulled back to 600 meters. The geometry of the encirclement was loosening. At 11:08, 41 minutes after the encirclement had been established, and 23 minutes after the first shots, the IRGCN controller broadcast a final transmission. The statement said that McFaul had been formally warned, and that the IRGCN reserved the right to take further defensive action in response to American provocation. Then the boats turned. All 8 turned simultaneously, north-northeast toward Iranian waters, speed 32 knots. By 11:22, they were 12 nautical miles away and outside effective engagement range. USS Roosevelt arrived at McFaul's position at 11:43. The area was clear. The 2 FA-18S remained on station until 12:09 when they were released back to their carrier. The post-incident review was extensive and covered 3 distinct areas: the tactical performance, the intelligence failure, and the strategic implications. On tactical performance, the CO's decisions were reviewed at every level from 5th Fleet to the CNO. The decision to return warning fire with a single Mark 38 burst, responding to the second Iranian warning shot with a proportionate, geometrically identical response, was the most scrutinized single action of the engagement. The review concluded that the response was within ROE authority, was proportionate, and produced the specific behavioral change it was designed to produce. 1 boat pulled back. The encirclement began to dissolve from that moment. The review characterized the decision as tactically sound and operationally precise. On intelligence, the elevated threat assessment at 0904, when 8 boats were observed converging, was reviewed against the imminent threshold. The review found that the pattern of 8 boats converging on an American vessel from 2 directions at converging speeds should have triggered an imminent assessment. The behavioral indicators were present. The analyst who produced the 0904 assessment had applied the historical baseline. 8 boats in the Gulf does not automatically mean imminent attack, and that baseline was inadequate for the specific geometry observed. Updated pattern recognition criteria for multi-boat convergence maneuvers were formally incorporated into Gulf Region Threat Assessment Guidelines. On strategic implications, the encirclement of a U.S. destroyer was documented as the most aggressive IRGCN surface action in the Gulf in over 3 decades. The authorization level required for an 8-boat coordinated encirclement with coordinated warning shots was assessed as senior IRGCN leadership, not a field commander's initiative. The political decision to take that action in response to an arms sale to Saudi Arabia established a new data point in Iran's coercive toolkit. The encirclement maneuver as a direct response to political events rather than solely a response to U.S. naval actions. The implication was that future U.S. decisions, arms sales, sanctions, diplomatic statements, could trigger a direct naval response against U.S. ships without those ships having done anything to provoke it tactically. The CO of USS McFaul was awarded the Legion of Merit 6 weeks after the incident in a ceremony that was not publicly announced. The citation described her leadership during a complex and dangerous naval confrontation without specifying the details. It noted her precise judgment under fire and her exceptional command presence. 83 words for 41 minutes in a box made of guns. The IRGCN boats returned to their bases without incident. Satellite imagery confirmed all 8 at their respective facilities within 36 hours. No visible damage to any vessel. No Iranian personnel were killed. No U.S. personnel were killed. No ships were sunk. The engagement produced no strategic change in the Gulf's operational environment, but it produced one data point that both sides recorded and studied. The warning shot that McFaul fired back, the single 25mm burst, 50 meters from the boat that had just fired across her stern, was the first time a U.S. surface combatant had returned fire in kind during a Gulf harassment operation in years. The boat pulled back. The encirclement dissolved. Whether that outcome was coincidence, or whether the IRGCN's encirclement doctrine had a built-in assumption that the U.S. side would not return fire, and that assumption had just been tested and found wrong, is a question that both sides were asking in the days that followed. The answer to that question determines how the next encirclement is planned. Stay vigilant, stay informed. I'll see you in the next one.